Recording in progress.
Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, marhaba. I'm pleased to welcome you to this new event within the Trans-Strategic Dialogue series, which we dedicate today to examining Turkey's position on the war in the Middle East, its perspective, and its management of the conflict, as well as the implications that extend beyond the region to broader international balances and global economic security, particularly in light of the unprecedented Iranian aggressive attacks on neighboring countries in the Arabian Gulf and the related unethical economic blackmail practices. So this war, with its military, political, security, economic, and even moral dimensions, is no longer a confined regional matter. Rather, it has become an issue in which the interests of major powers intersect and where considerations of regional stability overlap with calculations related to energy and global trade. Leading us to say with confidence that what comes after this war will clearly differ from what preceded it, whether in terms of relations, alliances, or even investments. From Turkey's perspective, this crisis may be read within the framework of a delicate balance between the requirements of national security, the necessities of regional stability, and its strategic interests across the Middle East, Asia, and Europe. Turkey, by virtue of its unique geopolitical location, its accumulated regional relations, and its wide engagement in recent years with countries in the region, finds itself directly concerned with the repercussions of this war, whether in terms of energy security, the stability of trade corridors, the management of rising regional tensions, or counter-terrorism efforts. Some believe that Ankara views this crisis as a test of its ability to maintain a pragmatic and a balanced foreign policy that avoids sharp polarization, while seeking to play potential mediation roles and strengthen channels of dialogue between the conflicting parties. However, this balance has become difficult in light of the domestic economic damage it has sustained on the one hand, and the severe impact of the war on its traditional allies on the other. This calls for clearer and more decisive Turkish position that go beyond diplomatic maneuvering or silence. Hence, the importance of this trans-strategic dialogue, through which we seek to explore the dimensions of the crisis from the perspective of key regional actors, foremost among them Turkey, in a way that contributes to building a more balanced and deeper understanding of the nature of the ongoing transformations. So thank you all for your attendance, and we look forward to an in-depth discussion that enriches the shared understanding of the sensitive stage in the evolution of the regional and indeed international order.
Thank you.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Hi. So it is my pleasure having you today with us. My name is Shamal Qatba, and I am a researcher at Trends Research and Advisory. And today I'm going to be moderating today's dialogue titled How Turkey Sees the War in the Middle East. So as you could know, today's discussion is going to explore how Turkey perceives and navigates the ongoing war in the Middle East, and how this conflict is basically, let's say, reshaping regional dynamics across various dimensions, such as security, economic, and also geopolitical dimensions. And as we have seen, this war extends beyond its immediate geography. It is disrupting trade routes, it is affecting energy markets, and it is also contributing to a broader shift in the regional balance of power. Within this context, we've seen Turkey, for example, it occupies a pivot position. It is navigating complex pressures through what is often described as a policy of active neutrality. So today we're going to be joined by an excellent group of speakers. First, I have Mr. Elkar Sezer, Managing Director of Turkey Today. We also have Dr. Baran Kayaoglu, Chair of American Studies at the Social Sciences University of Ankara. Joining us as well is Dr. Gökhan Çenkara, Media Commentator and Associate Professor at Necmettin Erbakan University in Konya. And finally, we're also pleased to have from Abu Dhabi, Dr. Sarhat, Senior Researcher and Director of Trends Virtual Office in Turkey. It is a pleasure having you all today with us.
Thank you.
I would like to begin by grounding our discussion in how Turkey's approach is actually unfolding in practice. So let me start with you, Mr. Elkar. So basically, given your field experience, of course, how does Turkey's balancing approach translate in practice, and where do you see its limits under rising polarization?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm certainly very happy of the cooperation between Turkey Today and Trends initiated by Sühabe. So thank you very much. So I think Turkey's role has been very limited. I mean, let's go back to the start, actually. Turkey's role has been very limited in preventing the war. Turkey was actively actually lobbying in Washington, D.C. to prevent this happening. But I mean, the common understanding in Ankara was that it's going to happen. It's going to happen no matter what. Even without U.S. support, Israel would be striking Iran no matter what kind of effort would be, because Israel's understanding was that Iran was at its weakest. So an attack on Iran was imminent in Turkey's position. And I'm going to be speaking at my capacity as a journalist, not as an academic, because I'm going to leave it to Gökhan Bey and Baran Bey, of course. Turkish position in the current fight is based on multiple factors, actually. First of all, this is a very under-talked thing about Turkish foreign policy. Turkey is very business-minded country. I mean, in the international media, you are going to see lots of ideological approach, ideological remarks. But I mean, in terms of Turkey's foreign policy approach, the country is very much business-minded. So any kind of conflict that is going to stay around Turkey for a long time is actually bad for Turkey. It is the same case with Ukraine and Russia war, and it's the same case with Iran war. So this is one of the factors that why Turkey will actually remain as a neutral actor. And I mean, this is actually a very long topic, how Turkey's foreign policy approach in the last 2 decades evolved from a very standard, let's say, dull approach to a business-minded and more active approach. I mean, this is a different topic. And also, there is another topic. I mean, Turkey wasn't really affected by the war itself so far. I mean, only 4 missiles, which is allowed in Turkish context. But I mean, you've seen how many missiles and drones have been flying in Gulf skies in the last 50 days. So if Turkey suffered such a thing in the last 2 months, then the approach, I mean, the neutrality of Turkey would have been tested easily. So, and I think Turkey is not after short-term gains. Maybe you have seen some articles on the international media that Turkey will be the beneficiary of this conflict economically because there's going to be some setback in the other part of the Middle East. I think this is a very wrong analysis. Turkey certainly is not after short-term gains, and if the war drags on in Turkey's geography, I think in the long run, Turkey is going to suffer the outcomes. I mean, in the short run, also because of the energy prices. I mean, Turkey has a very fragile economy and energy dependent. Although Turkey doesn't have much, oil tankers passing through Strait of Hormuz, the increasing energy prices is going to affect Turkey and is affecting Turkey actually. So, I mean, Turkey wasn't able to stop the war, but in terms of the in the first days of Iran war, Turkey was able to actually push its narrative in terms of the Kurdish minority in the northern Iran, because Turkey was very afraid, very cautious about a possible partition of Iran, because it will send actually massive repercussions to the Turkish borders, and a bigger war within Iran's borders. I mean, a land incursion, let's say, would actually lead to a big, massive migration crisis in Turkey's borders. So Turkey has a lot of reasons to stay neutral in this fight. But also Turkey is very accustomed to staying neutral and also running relations with both sides. I mean, take a look at the Ukraine-Russia war. Turkey never recognized Russia's annexation of Crimea. And Turkey actually, to a limited extent, helped Ukraine militarily, but also Turkey ran good relations with Russia. So Turkey knows not to put the same things to a single basket, but also running complex relations. And the last point I would like to make is that in the last decade, Turkey was working on maintaining the strategic autonomy, taking its own decisions in crucial issues. So I think it's very reasonable to expect that Turkey wouldn't bandwagon the Western countries, which actually bandwagon US on this issue, because this is Turkish-Iranian border has remained safe for many centuries, and the crisis is going to have very strong repercussions for Turkey. So I don't think that behind the scenes any request or any pressure on Turkey was made by the US to actively take a role in a war against Iran. But I think Turkey's strategic autonomy that the country has passionately worked on in the last decade paid off. And you see the anger from Trump on NATO as an organization. But let me close this my comment with this point. When President Trump lashes out at the NATO, I think he mostly means European countries, not NATO as an organization. So this kind of anti-NATO comments by Trump is not actually creating a big anxiety in Ankara. So all in all, Turkey is trying to work with both sides to achieve a long-lasting ceasefire or a permanent ceasefire. And there are so many reasons why Turkey must stay neutral in this fight.
Thank you so much. If I may follow up with a second question, again from your coverage of conflict diplomacy, do you think Turkey can also play a role as a mediator, and how is that perceived by actors in the ground, like on ground, like whether from Iran or also the US or Israel? Do you think it actually can't play that role?
Turkey tried before the war started. There was a Turkish effort to bring different sides to Istanbul, and everything was ready. Then these days, I was talking to my contacts, from the foreign ministry, then they were so sure that it was going to happen. But Iran backed in the last minutes. I think they have reasonable things to say on this withdrawal. First of all, they don't want Iran to be. Iran doesn't want to be in a negotiating setting where the regional actors are also in this table, and the number of topics are very wide. So Iran doesn't want to talk about the ballistic missile capacity. Iran doesn't want to talk about the support to the different militia groups in the Middle East. So Turkey was trying to organize a regional summit, including the US, where also the Gulf countries and some other actors can come and convey their opinion to Iran in an organized setting. So probably the reason was the last-minute decision from late Ali Khamenei. But Turkey actually tried, and after Iran refused participating in these talks, the common understanding in Turkey was that Iran doesn't want Turkey to have this leading role in a very decisive negotiation setting. So I don't think that's the full picture. I think Iran will never have Turkey as a mediator in such an important set of issues, but also Iran doesn't see Turkey as a totally neutral actor in a way that it sees Pakistan. I think Turkey plays the role of a facilitator instead of a mediator in this conflict, because Turkey doesn't have an official role, but also Turkey is very much involved in conveying the messages and also finding solutions because of the masterful Turkish foreign policy, I would say. But officially, I don't think Turkey plays a role of mediator, and I don't think that's very ideal. That's a very ideal country for Turkey, for Iran. For example, Iran-Egyptian relations are also not so bad, but I mean, Iran wouldn't see Egypt also as a possible mediator. So, I mean, Turkey's role now is limited, but I mean, I can see in Antalya, for example, Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan said Turkey doesn't have a problem with another country to host the peace negotiations. We are not envious of another country as long as there is a realistic peace. So this is Turkey's approach. Turkey is not running after this idea so passionately. But also I can see when I was in Antalya, there was an Antalya Diplomacy Forum, and it was actually very, very useful to see Hakan Fidan carried out so many important meetings on the Iran war with the Pakistani officials, and Asim Munir actually traveled to Antalya. It was an unannounced trip to Antalya. He stayed for around 5-6 hours, and he talked to Turkish officials. And he's the guy that Trump likes so much. I mean, the only general that Trump met while there was a prime minister in this country. So I think Turkey is doing a lot behind the scenes, but I mean, officially, I think Turkey's any official role as a mediator would have annoyed, I think, Iran.
Thank you very much for bringing that perspective into the discussion. I would like now to move from how the strategy is actually practiced to how it is conceptualized at the strategic level. So I'd like to now invite Dr. Baran, and I would like to ask you a question. How does Ankara situate Iran within the regional balance of power, and how pragmatic is its approach to competition and coexistence as well?
Thank you. First of all, thanks to the distinguished panelists, to our host, Friends Advisory, for putting this panel together. Very much honored to be with such a distinguished set of panelists. To your question, Ms. Shamma. I would say that Turkey and Iran generally view each other as what the current internet lingo would call frenemies. On the one hand, they're somewhat friends, and they occasionally could be adversaries as well. I wholeheartedly agree with Ikabe when he said that the front between the two countries has been stable, and since the 19th century, they really haven't had any open conflict with each other. There were some tense moments in the 1920s and 30s during the revolution of 1979. So occasionally in the late 1990s, although nothing as serious as anything we've seen in recent weeks and in recent months in this part of the world, but especially in the Gulf region. They view each other as friends in the sense that they share a common culture, common history, common demographics. As much as 20% of Iran's population are Turkic, predominantly Azerbaijanis and Qashqai Turks, etc. A lot of Turkmens up in the northeast. And of course, many of Iran's leading dynasties for the last millennium have been Turkic. In fact, there have been very few Persian rulers of Iran since the rise of the Safavids at the beginning of the 16th century. And of course, the Ottomans themselves were immensely under the influence of Persian culture. There's a lot of trade back and forth. There's a lot of the two countries need each other for the logistical routes to areas on the other side of one country. In the case of Iran, that would be Pakistan, that would be Turkestan, the Turkic republics of Central Asia. Before the Azerbaijan-Armenia peace, of course, Turkey's regional ally and fellow Turkic republic, Azerbaijan, was oftentimes reached through Turkish trade routes, through Iranian territory. So there's a lot that's in common, but they're also in competition with each other. We saw this most prominently in Syria, where the two sides backed different groups. Turkey with the armed rebels, different rebel factions, not just HTS, but formerly the Syrian National Army, which then, after the revolution of December 9th, 2024, folded into the central government forces. We also see them occasionally, I wouldn't want to call it butting heads, but again, standing on different sides over some of the issues in Iraq. Although within the context of Iraq, of course, Turkey seems to play a more predominant role within the KRG, with some exceptions. So, to the last part of your question, how would you describe the relationship? I would describe it by and large pragmatic, and for Turkey to mostly stay away whenever there's a conflict in the region, whether that's a civil war or cross-border fighting, is to by and large stay out of it, not try to get directly involved with it. The only exception to that, of course, being what is being done to the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank and the occupied Palestinian territories. Turkey did get involved in the Syrian civil war, in the Libyan civil war, but the lessons that it learned from those wars was to never let those sorts of conflicts to get between its relations and another regional power, not just Iran, but also Saudi Arabia, but also the United Arab Emirates. So one of the things that we saw in the last 5 or 6 years in Turkish foreign policy was not just pragmatism as a slogan, but pragmatism in practice. I really like the title of this panel, Active Neutrality. That actually comes from a title used by Professor Selim Deringil on Turkey's policy during World War II, where it was very active, engaging in different sorts of relations with the two major fighting sides, but also doing its best to stay neutral, which by and large worked for Turkey. The reason why I'm saying that, of course, there's a lot of fear. I don't necessarily agree with that all of these conflicts that we're seeing around the world in our region could lead to another world war. I'm much more sanguine. I'm much more optimistic about that. But Turkey's policy appears to be the same, very pragmatic in its approach towards Iran, but also making sure that it can bracket its ties with Iran so that it doesn't negatively affect its relations with other regional actors.
So alongside with what you've mentioned, and you've also described the relationship between Iran and Turkey as a pragmatic relationship. we're also seeing shifts, as you could see, within alliance structure. So how is Turkey navigating its relationship within NATO and the United States and also regional partners in this moment? How would you say that is working out at the moment?
I would say the key word here is compartmentalization, and we've seen Ankara do this a lot in recent years. So I mentioned Syria. Iran was not the only country with which Turkey has close relations on the one hand, but also stood on different sides in the Syrian civil war. Turkey had a similar problem with Russia, where the Putin administration supported the Assad regime, but Turkey and Russia were doing brisk business in a range of fields: investment, energy, construction, with respect to the Turkish construction section, the civil engineers working on mega projects in Russia, with Russian tourists coming into Turkey. And that really didn't get affected. It didn't even get affected from the war in Ukraine, Putin's war on Ukraine. So what you saw there was to focus on the areas of commonality and try to resolve, or at least contain, the areas of disagreement. And what we've seen so far in Turkish foreign policy since the late 2000 teens, it would be hard for me to give you a specific turning point, but I would say sometime around 2018, 2019, when Turkey conducted 2 additional operations in Syria to protect its interests and its borders, and to confront both the United States and Russia, but then sitting back and also focusing on the areas of commonality. In the case of the United States, with respect to relations within NATO, which became even more prominent with Russia's attack on Ukraine in February 2022, and then in the case of Russia and Iran, while fighting them in spring 2020 with Operation Spring Shield, and then making sure that basic diplomatic protocol and logic was still adhered to, so that Turkey could not allow these problems to get out of control. So to the here and now, I see similar trends at play. On the one hand, Turkey, yes, is a NATO member, but as Ilker Bey pointed out, President Trump excoriating NATO allies for not doing a whole lot about the Strait of Hormuz, Ankara did not take that personally as an offense, as an affront to itself, because there's a very simple answer to that. Well, do you want us to clear the mines in the Black Sea to make sure that grain and energy can flow out of the Turkish Straits from Istanbul, from Çanakkale, from the Bosphorus, from the Dardanelles to the rest of the world? Or do you want us to deploy our minesweepers to the Persian Gulf? You can't have both of those things, Ankara would have told, had we been taken to task that way. So there was that. With respect to the region, you may have paid attention to you may have witnessed this, that Ankara took to task, especially Israel, for goading the United States into a war against Iran, but equally having taken Iran to task for dragging Gulf Arab countries into this war, which really wasn't yours, right? It's one of the most ironic instances of history. I understand from a strategic point of view why the Iranians did it. From an operational point of view, why the Iranians focused on the Gulf Arab countries as opposed to lobbing more missiles and drones at Israel. But that's going to come at a political cost. And Ankara pointed this out. I mean, Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan, not so much President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, but Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan offered that duality on multiple occasions, that both of those things could be wrong. And he actually specifically said, 2 wrongs don't make a right. So that's really been Turkey's position, I would say, in terms of balancing these different sorts of relations, sort of, juggling these different balls in the air and trying to make sure that none of them drops on the floor so far. And Ilker Bey and I have had these conversations multiple times. You may recall at the beginning of the work, on day 4 or day 5 of the war, Azerbaijan, its Nakhchivan exclave, stuck between Armenia, Russia, and Turkey, was attacked from Iran. And it looked for a second like Azerbaijan was going to join the fight. And Turkey and Azerbaijan both made sure that they wouldn't join this fight, because by and large, it wasn't our fight. So I would say that's how Turkey's approach to these different geopolitical tensions, these pulls and pulls, have been. And in the long term, I do expect certain things to change, but maybe we can have that conversation in a later question on a later section. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Baran. That really helps us situate Turkey within the broader strategic and alliance landscape. I would like now to take this one step further and look at the wider systemic shifts shaping state behavior. And I would like to now turn to Dr. Gautam. So navigating systemic transition, to what extent can Turkey sustain a cost-benefit driven strategy amid weakening norms and increasing self-help behavior?
And I also thank you, Dr. Serhat Çubukçuoğlu and the trans team. I think it is timely discussion for our big challenges around our region. I think that if we go back to international relations basic, your question is very important. The international system, as we observe, currently locked in brutal transition. The unipolar moment is that now, and we haven't yet figured out a multipolar balance. While we're stuck in this middle phase, the global norms are actively fading. Multilateral institutions are failing to prevent a conflict or manage our crisis. As a result, states are rapidly returning to classic self-help system, as you mentioned. This is exactly how Kenneth Walls, prominent professor in international relations, described structural realism for this phenomena decades ago. We are no longer reading about in textbooks. We are watching it dictate state behavior in real time. When we look at Ankara's transactional and cost-benefit foreign policy over the last decade, I think we must stop misdiagnosing it, because especially the pundits often frame Turkey's behavior as an identity crisis or a departure from its historical axis. I think it is neither. It is a structural necessity for Ankara. Turkey is adapting to exact self-help environment the collapsing system has forced upon it. I think the critical question for this panel is not why Turkey is doing this, but how long they can sustain it. I think that the sustainability of this strategy depends entirely on three distinct pillars: defense capacity, the management of geopolitical vacuums, and macroeconomic limitations. And Turkey is actively trying to offset the realities of weakening alliances by building asymmetric military power. I think some numbers are very important for understanding this stuff. In the early 2000s, Turkey defense industry was heavily dependent on foreign supplies. Localization was maybe at 20%. Today, that figure is hovering around 80%. This is not just a statistical shift for Turkey, it is a strategic realignment. In 2023 alone, Turkish defense and aerospace exports exceeded $5 billion. And we are looking at platforms like Bayraktar TB2, the Akıncı, and the fifth generation Kaan fighter jet project. Analytically, I think this is very helpful for Turkish diplomatic maneuvering in the region. And as the world gets more self-help, Ankara weaponizes this military industrial capacity as a primary foreign policy tool. We see this footprint everywhere from North Africa to Caucasus. Turkey's actively military exports helping for his diplomacy, especially in Libya and Nagorno-Karabakh. And this is very helpful when the crisis hit the West. This exact hardware is Ankara's hardest bargaining chip, I think. The second pillar is that the people love to call Turkey's balancing act between Russia, China, and the West an axis shift. Analytically speaking, it is a just classic hedging. Ankara remains firmly under the NATO security umbrella, while simultaneously engaging with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. If you look at the operational theaters right now, Turkey is negotiating with Russia over airspace condition in Syria. It is backing Ukraine's defense in the Black Sea, and it concerns Western energy and the security demands in Eastern Mediterranean. I think that Turkey's current autonomy stems more from the widening cracks between the big players than from its own absolute power. Ankara is expertly exploiting the fragmentation of the global order, and they compartmentalize conflict. And I think it defines the Turkish new position now. Which leads to us to final and the most restrictive variable, the economics. I think is the actual heels of this anti-grant strategy of Ankara, and a self-help world is incredibly expensive, and constant military readiness drains resources. Expanding and maintaining cross-border operation in Syria and Iraq drains resources of Ankara. And if you look at the data, the European Union still handles roughly 40% of Turkey's exports. The vast majority of foreign direct investment still comes from the West. When Turkey does business with Russian or Gulf capital, it is highly transactional. We are talking about the swap agreements and deferred energy payments, and how many injections in the central bank to stabilize the currency. If we return to the core question, how long Ankara sustain this cost-benefit strategy, Turkey can pull this off exactly as long as the international system remains uncertain, I think.
Dr. Gugan, if we can bring this closer to the ground, particularly in Syria and also in Iraq, how are the dynamics of the current war shaping Turkey's security posture there? And are we seeing continuity, or are we seeing meaningful shift in also priorities?
I think that the escalation we are watching in the Gulf is not a localized crisis. The expanding conflict zone, from Red Sea disruptions to the activation of Iran's proxy networks, is systematically shaking the balance of power across the Levant and Mesopotamia. And to understand Turkey's operational playbook in Syria and Iraq right now, I think we have to strip away the daily tactical stuff. We need to look at the structural baseline. The real driver behind Ankara's policies is the historical collapse of these two states. Iraq lost its central monopolistic authority over violence in 2003. Syria lost it in 2011. These are not just states on a timeline, they are structural ruptures. As Charles Thiel mentioned, the war made the state and the state made the war. But in the modern Middle East, we are watching the exact opposite. Wars are breaking the states. When central authority evaporates, the resulting vacuum inevitably becomes an incubator for terror organization and foreign proxies. No rational state can tolerate, as Turkey, a 900-kilometer border with a collapsed entity controlled by hostile non-state actors. And Turkey and didn't choose to become a frontline state in this cause. The collapse of Baath regime, Syria and Iraq also, forced it into this posture. And Turkey is the only functional the bureaucracy-minded state holding the line against the complete regional fragmentation. And if we look back to the Iraq scene, Turkey's Iraq policy was strictly securitized. The primary objective was quarantining the terror organization PKK in the northern mountains. And for decades, the Iraq central government failed to police its own sovereign territory. That failure created an existential security threat for Ankara. And that architecture has evolved through the sequential glove-lock military operation. Turkey didn't just launch temporary raids, it built a deep physical buffer zone and permanent network of forward operating bases across the border. And Turkey today de facto military footprint in the northern Iraq effectively blocks the terror corridor, and Ankara established the necessary coercion element to secure its borders. And if we back to the Syrian scene, Syria requires a completely updated analytical framework, I think. We are no longer looking at static and paralyzed conflict zone in Syria because Damascus has a new administration. A change in political leadership doesn't but instantly rebuild a collapsed state. The structural vacuums remain. The institutional decay of the last 15 years is still the primary reality on the ground. And this political transition radically changes Turkey's operational playbook in these days. And diplomatic normalization between Gulf states and Turkey set the stage for this exact moment in Syria. Because Gulf capitals realize that funding proxy actors is not working in Syria, they are looking at new administration in Damascus, and they know financial reconstruction cannot happen without the physical security. And the Gulf has the capital, and the Turkey holds the security architecture, and they are fundamentally aligned in Syria now.
Thank you, Dr. Gukhan. That brings an important dimension, I see, into the discussion. Now, I would like to turn to the future trajectory and how Turkey positions itself within an evolving regional order. And Dr. Sarhat, let me bring you in on this. So if we take a step back and look at the emerging regional hierarchy, where does Turkey see itself in the evolving regional order, and how might the war outcome affect its strategic position, let's say?
Thank you, Shamma. I think Turkey is a pivotal middle power, right? Trying to shape outcomes without being fully drawn into the war. So in other words, it's neither a passive bystander nor a follower, and its posture may be characterized as other esteemed speakers have also said, active neutrality. So balancing deterrence, diplomacy, and strategic autonomy while protecting its borders and expanding ties with the Gulf countries. Now, there are two parts to answer your question. One is what Turkey doesn't want to see happen, and two is how it wants to shape evolving regional order. So on the first part, I think Ankara's immediate goal is, as has been discussed, to stay out of the war while managing a delicate regional balance. Yes, I think Turkey wants to see or have Iran's wings clipped, quote unquote, to prevent it meddling in the affairs of Syria and Iraq, while simultaneously preventing, Israel from achieving regional hegemony. In other words, Turkey's ideal outcome is a weakened Iran, but not a state collapse. A checked Israel, one that is not regionally hegemonic, and the war contained, not expanded throughout the region. The reason why Ankara does not want a fragmented and collapsed Iran is because, as has been discussed, that could produce refugee inflows, resurgence of PKK militancy, all sorts of border instability, and further shocks to energy prices. At the same time, Turkey doesn't want to see the war and in a way that leaves Israel as the uncontested architect of a new regional order. Then there is skepticism of external interventions, despite long-standing co-opetition with Tehran, I think Ankara remains deeply skeptical of the US or Israeli regime change efforts in the region. And that caution comes partly from experience. regime change, proxy wars, all these external interventions around Turkey's borders usually generate second-order instability that Ankara ends up paying for. So from Turkey's perspective, a fragmented Iran would literally be a disaster. Now, on the second part of the question, how Turkey wants to shape the evolving regional order, I think in the bigger picture, this war is just not just about another regional crisis. I'm going to come back to what Dr. Gökhan Çınkara explained. So this is instead part of a broader systemic transition and redistribution of power, because all assumptions about regional security and architecture are eroding, as we all know. So there are direct pressures now on infrastructure, trade routes, resilience, and Turkey is trying to survive in and shape a more turbulent regional order in an evolving, I would argue, a multipolar world order. So we live in a reality of high energy costs and blocked routes or changing trade routes. And also, as Mr. İlker Sezer said, this is not a short-term windfall that Turkey is looking for, but rather positioning itself as an indispensable long-term transit corridor and a major actor. Take, for instance, the cargo flows that are diverting to Turkish ports, other alternative vital logistics hubs or trade routes being reconsidered, like the Middle Corridor or the Development Road project, both of which might offer both economic relief and geopolitical leverage to Turkey, etc., etc. And it's come to the fore now that transit connectivity is a source of power. And so Turkey, by trying to turn geography into strategy, is seeking to leverage its position as an energy and logistics corridor at this crucial time when, as we all know, the Strait of Hormuz, Bab el-Mandeb, and even to a certain extent the Suez Canal have become more vulnerable. So that adds to not just an economic opportunity, but into Turkey's diplomatic weight. So how is Turkey trying to achieve these goals? One is by shifting toward collective diplomacy. So as opposed to the past, Turkey is no longer acting in isolation, and that I think should be considered as a major shift in Turkish strategic thinking. It's increasingly framing its response to the war within a collective regional context, holding regular consultations. I think it's been the third or the fourth with Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan, to be seen not only as a military and logistical actor, but also as a useful broker, one that can speak to many parties across rival lines. So this approach, on one hand, it's true that it aims to build, I think, a strategic barrier against potential Israeli, economic or strategic ambitions after the war. And you can call it, as our speakers mentioned, a counterbalancing and hedging strategy. Because this broader realignment among the 3-4 countries I mentioned are against both an Iranian attempt to destabilize and impose its hegemony on the region, but also against a post-war over-concentration of Israeli power in the region. So circling back to what would be Turkey's preferred war outcome, if the war ends in a US-Iran settlement that preserves the Iranian regime, but constrains its reach, i.e. clips its wings, that is probably the outcome most compatible with Turkish interests. Because this kind of settlement without collapse scenario, for the reasons I explained, is the most advantageous one for sustaining Turkey's regional position and preventing the escalation of border threats. It would reduce the danger of regional fragmentation, keep Iran as a recognizable state, but limit space for an otherwise, and either an Iranian or an Israeli-dominated security architecture. It's the one that best aligns with Ankara's view of regional security and room for maneuver. If, on the other hand, the war ends in an Iranian total collapse or in a decisive US/Israeli-led ordering, Turkey's position could weaken significantly. In that case, I think Ankara would face a much more militarized eastern and southern neighborhood, growing uncertainties around its own Kurdish question and the ongoing settlement process, stronger anti-Turkey alignments, which we might come to in a few bits, and greater pressure in Syria and, of course, the Eastern Mediterranean. So the short answer is that Turkey sees itself as a balancer, a mediator, but also as a transit hub and an autonomous middle power. And it's aiming for a post-war regional order in which no single actor, whether Israel or Iran, can dominate the region at Ankara's expense.
Dr. Sarhat, if we can, let's say, extend that geographically, we're also seeing an increasing spillover into the Eastern Mediterranean. So how does the development in the Middle East intersects with dynamics in areas like Cyprus, particularly with Israel's growing footprint? And what does this mean for Turkey's posture, let's say?
That's an excellent point. Thank you for the question, Shamma. I think for Turkey, the Middle East and the Eastern Mediterranean are no longer separate theaters. In Turkish strategic thinking, this is one big connected geopolitical space, stretching from the Gulf and the Levant to Cyprus, the Aegean Sea, and even, I would say, central Mediterranean, like Libya. So the first spillover effect is strategic. I mean, undoubtedly, the regional order is more polarized. And as I mentioned, Ankara is concerned that Israel will try to translate this wartime momentum into a wider anti-Turkey architecture, in the region, in the Eastern Mediterranean, the foundations of which are already in place. And specifically, I'm referring to the consolidation of the quote-unquote 3+1 alliance between Greece, Republic of Cyprus, or the Greek-administered part of Southern Cyprus, and Israel, backed by the United States. So there is no point in hiding this, because Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan openly labeled this formation as a direct threat to Turkish national security during his speech at the Antalya Diplomacy Forum. Our esteemed speakers were there, so they are witness to this. Because Ankara believes that Israel's next objective after dealing with Iran could be to weaken Turkey's role and push it back in Syria, expand alignments with the countries mentioned that reduce essentially Turkish influence in the region. And there is some substance to it. Let's accept that. Yeah. So if you look at Israel's growing footprint, like the delivery of advanced air defense missiles to Cyprus, which can be considered as a major escalatory shift from Turkish perspective, I'm saying this. Although from the Greek or the Israeli perspective, it can be argued as a defensive move, but sometimes perceptions matter more than the reality itself, and there are misperceptions, might be. But in any case, I think this is raising anxieties in Ankara, no matter what. And materially, it challenges Turkey's long-held air superiority over the island and the Eastern Mediterranean. So this growing footprint, as well as the more recent deployment of Greek and European military assets on the island after the start of the war, overall, they increase a surveillance, air defense, and intelligence density around the island. So Cyprus is a much more crowded and dangerous place now than it used to be 2 or 3 months ago. That matters to Turkey because Cyprus is not a standalone flashpoint. As I explained, because of the wider picture that Turkey sees this through, it's a much wider perspective of the one big connected theater. Cyprus is central to Ankara's geopolitical position, autonomy, and access posture in the Eastern Med, without which it believes that it will be completely locked out. And these are, the 3+1 deals and so on. These are not just bilateral defense sale or technical cooperation or diplomatic gesturing maneuvers. It's a real security architecture that creates pressures on Turkey's maritime and air posture in the region beyond Cyprus, constraining its access to open seas and potential energy deposits therein. And more broadly, frankly, Ankara has viewed this Eastern Mediterranean frameworks, these emerging security mechanisms as exclusionary, as strategic encirclement. And this is a structural long-term challenge from Turkey's point of view. It's not a temporary one that will disappear if, say, there's a change in the Israeli government after the elections this October. It's like a state policy. So I'm not going to go into some war scenarios that are being floated around, on social media and newspapers. I think they're not worth the discussion. But an important point to note here is Egypt. I think Ankara's rapprochement with Cairo is not only about bilateral normalization after the brief period of cooling ties. It's also about preventing the Eastern Mediterranean from hardening into a permanently anti-Turkey bloc. Egypt's role is important for Ankara as a counterweight, as mentioned, to Israel's regional growing footprint and ambitions, and as part of a broader balancing logic alongside Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. Let's add to that Libya as a strategic buffer, which is not a peripheral question at all. It's central now. If you look at the agreements between Libya and Turkey on maritime delimitation and military cooperation, and Turkey's drive to consolidate its maritime zones that are dubbed quote unquote as blue homeland, and its most recent rebalancing act to reach out and engage both sides of Libyan actors. These are all about long-term viability of those previously agreed arrangements, because what happens there directly affects Ankara's position in the Eastern Med. And coming to my final points as an important point about resilience, as we saw from the UAE's response to the war, sovereignty and deterrence are now being redefined around resilience, continuity, and infrastructure protection, not only territorial defense. And so apply that to the Eastern Mediterranean. So Turkey will increasingly start thinking about ports, sea lanes, radar coverage and air defense, energy routes, and commercial corridors as part of one integrated strategic picture. So in terms of diplomatic recalibration, Turkey is transitioning from coercive power projection of the late 2010s to more adaptive engagement by reconciling with Egypt, Libya, and extending its outreach to the Gulf countries. Turkey is trying to break its isolation and ensure that its core maritime and energy interests are or remain intact. So overall, Middle East dynamics split into the Eastern Mediterranean through alliances, military technology, maritime zones, and strategic geography. If Cyprus is the frontline symbol of that spillover, I would say Libya is the Western anchor of that strategy. Egypt is an important balancing power in the southeast, and Israel's growing footprint is viewed less as an isolated development by Ankara than as part of a broader effort to constrain Turkish influence. So the likely posture going forward, therefore, is one of firmer deterrence, I think, tighter regional coordination, and stronger assertion to be involved in the regional decision-making bodies. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sarhati, for these inputs. And I think by that, we're going to conclude today's panel discussion. Today, we have explored how Ankara balances deterrence and diplomacy, how it navigates alliances and rivalries, and how it also positions itself within an emerging regional order marked by uncertainty and also transformation. I would like to extend my sincere thanks to our distinguished speakers for sharing their valuable insights, and to our audience also for joining us today. On behalf of Trends Research and Advisory, thank you once again. And now I'd like to hand over the mic to my colleague, Latifa Janebi, to end with the closing remarks. Latifa, the mic is yours.
Hello, everyone. It's nice to meet you. So, ladies and gentlemen, as we conclude this in-depth discussion on the Turkish perspective on the war in the Middle East, the importance of this viewpoint becomes clear in understanding the trajectory of the crisis and the reshaping of regional and international interactions in the post-war phase. The contributions have shown that we are at a pivotal moment that is redrawing maps of influence and necessitating a redefinition of relations among regional powers, foremost among them Turkey, which seeks to strengthen its position as a balancing actor capable of engaging with various parties without sliding into sharp polarization. It has also become evident that this war cannot be reduced to its immediate military or political dimensions. Rather, it extends to encompass cross-border economic and security dimensions that directly affect market stability, energy security, and global supply chains, all of which are core to Turkish interests. In this context, Turkey has emerged as an actor that is affected by the crisis, yet at the same time, possesses important tools of influence, whether through its geographic position, its economic capabilities, or its potential diplomatic roles in managing regional tensions. Building on this and summarizing the key points discussed in these productive sessions, a set of strategic directions can be articulated as follows. First, emphasizing the importance of strengthening Gulf-Turkish partnership as a cornerstone for ensuring regional stability and serving the shared interests of the people of the region. Second, affirming the full rejection of all Iranian attacks against countries in the region, particularly the GCC states, as well as certain attacks that targeted Turkish territory during the war, considering them a blatant violation of these countries' sovereignty and unjustified acts of aggression, especially given that these states neither participated in nor allowed their territories to be used in attacks against Iran. Third, emphasizing the importance of supporting diplomatic efforts aimed at de-escalation and investing in mediation roles as a tool to enhance regional stability and reduce security risks. Fourth, strengthening the economic resilience of countries in the region in the face of external shocks, particularly in trade and supply chains, in order to mitigate the impact of geopolitical volatility. Fifth, rejecting any solutions or settlements that do not achieve sustainable stability and security in the region, including rejecting the use of the Strait of Hormuz as a tool for coercion or bargaining, or any threat to freedom of navigation. In conclusion, despite the challenges it presents, this crisis also opens the way for Turkey to redefine its regional role in a more effective and balanced manner, leveraging its geopolitical position and strategic maneuverability. The central challenge remains the ability to transform this complex geopolitical moment into an opportunity to enhance regional stability. Thank you all, and we look forward to more in-depth and expansive intellectual engagements ahead. We look forward to your participation in the next Trans-Strategic Dialogue, titled The War in the Middle East, How South Korea Sees the Crisis, on Thursday, 23 April 2026 at 10 a.m. UAE time. Thank you all.